you think about the most successful companies over a sustained period of time, those are companies that really have alignment of all of their different, all the different elements. And so when you think about brand and culture and you think about facing off to your various stakeholder groups, it's really important that those two be aligned. And so when we think about delivering value to our customers, we have a brand commitment, and our colleagues have to deliver against that brand commitment.
As Chief Human Resources Officer and member of the Executive Committee at Citizens, Susan LaMonica oversees a team that's responsible for organizational development and culture, talent acquisition, leadership and talent development, learning, DE&I, compensation and benefits, and human resources service delivery. Susan plays a key role in the company's transformation, driving the adoption of an agile operating model and leading the deployment of programs and initiatives that focus on the acquisition of emerging skills and the reskilling and upskilling of the workforce to be ready for the future. Susan, welcome to Voices of HR.
Thanks so much, Berta. It's great to be with you.
Well, we are so excited to have you with us because you are this incredible CHRO that sits on the executive committee at your organization. And unlike most organizations, you believe in the power of converging brand and HR. If you will, for our Voices of HR audience, will you just give us a little bit of background on why you believe that is a magic formula?
Yeah, and I would say it's brand and culture, right? And I think it's, we really do believe in the power of alignment. And I think when you think about the most successful companies over a sustained period of time, those are companies that really have alignment of all of their different, all the different elements. And so when you think about brand and culture and you think about facing off to your various stakeholder groups, it's really important that those two be aligned. And so when we think about, just to use an example, as we think about delivering value to our customers, we have a brand commitment, and our colleagues have to deliver against that brand commitment. And so if our colleagues don't feel that connection, and quite frankly, if we're not treating our colleagues in a fashion that is consistent with our brand commitment, there's going to be a disconnect, there's going to be misalignment. So I think it's just really, really critical that all of our stakeholders, quite frankly, feel the power of our commitment to each of them.
So we have a lot of HR listeners on Voices of HR that are from small to medium-sized companies. You're a large organization, which almost makes it more difficult and almost impossible to make sure that all of this aligns. So if you will, help us walk through where is that decision made to ensure that there is a comprehensive synergy between brand and culture and all these disparate parts that make you Citizens Financial Group?
I think, it's a good question. And if I might maybe just kind of dial the clock back a bit, because
Sure.
I think there's some uniqueness in our history, which I think is instructive and kind of gave us a bit of an opportunity to really consciously make that decision. So if I think back to back in 2014, when Citizens had been part of the Royal Bank of Scotland, and we went through an IPO, at the time the largest commercial bank IPO in the U.S. And at that time, there were a lot of things that were ailing Citizens, and a lot of things that had been underinvested in, and RBS, if you might recall, and that's Royal Bank of Scotland, was government owned, was one of the tragedies coming out of the financial crisis in 2008. And so, at that time, we had a real opportunity, to really get the organization aligned around what is the vision, what is what is the short term, the medium term, the longer term vision for the company, and how are we going to align all of the different bits and pieces of the organization, from our product strategies and our business strategies to our technology strategy to our colleague strategy, to ensure that we're all rowing in the same direction. And at that time, we had limited resources, so we had to be really, really judicious to ensure that every swing of the bat we were really going to optimize and maximize the impact. And so, where did the decision sit? The decision really sat with the executive committee of the organization to, and seeing the opportunity that we had, if we could get everybody on the same page and ensure that we had alignment across all the stakeholders, across the entirety of the ecosystem. Because I think the only way you really drive meaningful and sustainable change is by taking an ecosystem approach.
Mm-hmm. Which is one of the most difficult parts, right? To gain agreement at the top so that it does cascade down into the organization. So the next $1 million question that I'm sure all of our HR pros want to know is, how do you do it? I mean, these, even HR and leadership, I know that you are a huge proponent of great leadership as well. How do you make it all happen on a daily basis?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think, again, I come back to an ecosystem. When I came here, there was a lot of good stuff going on, but it was very process oriented. So we run this process, we run that process. It wasn't about, how to, again, we really think about the ecosystem. So to answer your question, I'm not sure it's probably not I'm not sure I have $1 million answer for your $1 million question, but I do think it's, it does, you mentioned leadership, and we were very clear at the time, and we continue to be, we had very limited resources. We had a ROTC that was 4%. So, we were limited in our ability to invest, but we said is, and to this day, we still talk about leaders as the Uber lever. If we only had one place to focus, if we can get the leadership equation right, then so many other things take care of themselves. Great leaders can smooth things over. If you don't have the greatest technology, you don't have the greatest facilities, whatever it is, great leaders can figure out how to kind of make it all happen and deliver the outcomes that the organization really desires. And so we made a very significant series of investments in our leaders. And when I talk about leaders, I'm not just talking about the C-suite. I'm talking about leaders throughout the organization. We have, call it 2,300, 2,500 leaders, people who have responsibility for leading teams in the organization. And we put in place a series of programs, as well as other supports that had a common red thread throughout, but were appropriately pitched at the different levels. And we in a very disciplined fashion engaged those colleagues. But it wasn't just touching people with programming. There was coaching. We still do, monthly manager meetings that are, like an hour in duration, where we're constantly giving managers little snippets of information. We even, to this day, we just refreshed our leadership strategy, because, and I don't want to jump ahead in our conversation, but clearly, with the current environment, it's very challenging. And so we've really feel that our leaders need to make a pivot, and we've recommitted to investing in that group, and starting with the top of the house, with the CEO and his direct reports. We've done some very intense leadership work that has enabled people to look inside of themselves about, and understand why they behave the way they behave, and as leaders, and then look at the collective behavior of leadership teams. So all of that to just, and I'm happy to go into more detail, but I would say, if I only had one place to focus, it would be leadership. Having said that, there were a lot of other things that we did at the time beyond leadership, in terms of building out our learning practices and ensuring that, we're providing colleagues with the tools and the resources so that they could be successful now as well as in the future. We did a lot of work around wellness. So we tried to look at the entirety of the colleague. But again, I come back to, leadership is, if you can have all that other stuff working and humming, but if you don't have leaders who really, as you know, right, are setting the tone and are reinforcing, the messaging and really being stewards of the brand, going back to your original question, you're going to be suboptimal.
And leadership is so incredibly important. I know you've been, you've described corporate leadership as being at a crossroad, and you just touched on that. When we talk about the leaders of the future in your organization or any organization, what are the top maybe 3 skills that you think new leaders need to employ moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a choppy time, which is
It
full
is.
of lots of challenges, but lots of opportunities. So, what we talk about is we talk about making this pivot to bold leaders, and we talk about this notion of bold leadership, and what we mean by that is we need leaders who are curious, they're inspirational, right? We're all, people want to be inspired. They're masters of disruption. So when we think about, all the change that's happening in the competitive environment, in the economic environment, in the social environment, very disruptive. And so we need leaders who really can lead through that. And then the last thing I would probably say is being able to lead not only with your head, but with your heart, right? And we certainly saw coming out of the pandemic, the power of empathetic leadership. And so, people are people and people want to connect with people. And we need our leaders to really, in a very authentic, genuine way, connect with folks in a way that, drives, connects them to the greater purpose of the company, and inspires them, quite frankly, to do things that they didn't think was possible.
So while I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about all of our HR leader listeners that are saying, okay, I've been telling my leadership that we need to upgrade, that we need to upskill, that we need to reskill some of our workers in order to transform and be competitive in the future. Could you give them a couple of pieces of advice? What are the first 2 things maybe that they should do to convince their leadership that, yes, there is disruption happening right now. Here's what we need to do in order to capture the future moving forward?
Yeah, not to be flip, right? But I think, just reading, reading some of the popular press and tuning into some of the best thinkers, who are thinking about kind of the future of work and honestly, getting out and talking to your customers, because when we get out and talk to customers and you hear what's on their minds in terms of the kinds of issues they're wrestling with, quite frankly, the kinds of things that other competitors are coming to the table with, you do, that becomes eye-opening. Having said that, again, coming back to the work we've done with our leaders, we've brought in, we bring our leaders, our top, call it, so we're a company of about 18,000 people. We bring our top 130 together twice a year. And every one of those sessions has a leadership component to it. And without exception, every session is also very much bringing the outside in and very future oriented. And so, my suggestion would be to, find room to gather your leaders together and bring the outside in so that you're not the only one, talking about what's happening in the world and the need to pivot. But that has been hugely powerful and quite frankly, convincing it's helpful when you have a CEO, right? I mean, this has to be CEO led. So I think one of the most important roles that we play as HR professionals and as CHROs is is cultivating that relationship with that CEO, because the CEO needs to be, really back to my point on alignment, tight alignment between the
Mm-hmm.
CHRO. And so, I spend a lot of time. We have a great CEO who's very forward leaning. And so,
Mm-hmm.
it's very helpful, but that's where I think that's where you gotta start. And then I think the other thing you need to do is to build in accountabilities, right? So it's, talk is cheap, as we all know. So there has to be some real accountabilities that are built in for folks to, be desirous of, leaning forward and looking at the implications of the, all that's happening in the world around us.
Yeah, because when I heard you say the word disruption, I think some people think about that as a willingness to show their bad behavior. And that doesn't mean disruption doesn't mean that it's a free for all, right? There's still certain core values and expectations that a leader has, and obviously held to a much higher standard. And you are one of those who advocates for high performing workplaces, which then translates to me into you do have an ecosystem of accountability at Citizens under your leadership. So, can you talk a little bit about what high performance means to you and what those expectations look like for your entire organization, not just your leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think what we have done, again, it comes back to this point around alignment, is, it starts with what are we in the business of doing, right? What are we really trying
Mm,
to do? And what are the business strategies that we're employing, and what are the outcomes, right? I think,
mhm,
getting really clear about outcomes, and that was, and I would say we're still on a journey on this.
mhm,
So it's, you have a lot of folks who tend to look at activities and, be activity junkies. And
mhm,
yes, you need activities to ultimately drive outcomes, but sometimes, we're not as clear as we need to be. And so trying to really work with the leadership teams to ensure that we're really clear about outcomes, that and it all starts with the business strategy. Let's get really clear about, what is the opportunity and what are the choices that we're making and what are the trade-offs, right? Really understanding that, and then getting very clear about what are the outcomes, and then what does good look like, right? What is driving
mhm.
to what does high performance look like? And we're very and again, I think this is because of the roots coming out of the leaner days, coming out of the IPO. We made commitments to the street about what we could
Mm,
do in the short term, the medium term, and to our, not just our financial stakeholders, but and our investors, but all of our stakeholders. And
mhm,
having that discipline and that transparency around, these are the commitments we're making. This is what we're trying to accomplish. These are the outcomes that we're driving towards, and then having that transparency and that discipline on a very regular basis of kind of monitoring that progress. And that applies across whether you're talking about, financial outcomes, cultural outcomes, talent outcomes, et cetera.
so you also are an advocate of what I call multidimensional workforces, aka diverse workforces. And I think the popular press has taken the word diversity and it has been watered down to the degree that we've kind of forgotten what it actually means within our organizations. Can you give us your definition and how you employ multidimensional populations or diversity within Citizens?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think at the end of the day, at the core of diversity and our diversity efforts really is the notion of inclusion and belonging.
Mm,
And in my mind, that's the holy grail,
mhm,
because you can have a very, diverse workforce in terms of the diversity that we can see,
mhm,
but not have an inclusive culture, and not, provide an environment where people truly can excel. So for me and for us, we tend to really focus on this notion of inclusion and belonging, which, lots of people talk about.
mhm,
but it's, it's easier said than done. And,
Mm-hmm.
We have spent a lot of time and effort to drive towards a more inclusive environment. And I would say again here, it's a journey. We certainly can't declare victory. But once again, when we think about from an ecosystem point of view, what we have done is, we're threading together this system, and so one of the tools that have been incredibly successful for us is our business resource groups, which we've got 6 business resource groups, and we have probably 3,500 folks that are active participants in those groups, and we really lean on those groups to help to guide us around our work with customers, our work with colleagues, and our work with our communities. And so we've kind of woven what we call as our 3 C's into those business resource groups. We also hold our leaders accountable for progress around a whole host of different elements under the diversity, equity, inclusion umbrella, but in particular around inclusion and belonging. And we use we have, much like many organizations, we have a listening strategy, and we've got different listening tools that we use in order to kind of help us to, turn the ship a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. And we've also just recently embarked on a certification process with MLT, which is it's particularly focused on the Black and Brown communities. But what are the barriers that really exist in our workplace that we need to address in order to truly, create that playing field where everybody can truly succeed. So there's a number of things that we're doing to drive towards this more inclusive organization. And again, I think we're making progress, but we're not, we can't declare victory.
So you are the first one that I have heard state that they leverage your business resource group as a bottom-up strategy to inform change within your organization. Definite best practice. Have you seen some impactful changes come from that?
Yeah, I mean, and just again a little bit of background. We were very deliberate when we were kicking these off to we didn't, there's certainly a networking component to them, and that's important, right? You want to give colleagues a safe space in order to discuss issues. But we said we really want these to have a business focus. We really want to, leverage these folks, and we use them, quite frankly, as we're launching products. We'll tap into the business resource groups to say, what do you think? How would this land?
That's great.
And similarly, with all the conversation around return to office, very hot topic. Hopefully we don't spend any time on it here. But suffice it to say, we've engaged our business resource groups to help to inform some of our direction there. Similarly, on the community front, we've done the same. So there's very tangible things that they're weighing in on. I use them from a policy point of view. We recently, the most recent business resource group that we just launched is a caregivers group, which I actually have the privilege of being the executive sponsor for, and we're leveraging that group to kind of help us as the employees or colleagues are so stretched and stressed given the external environment, and we really, as I said earlier, we really do feel that for us, our people to do their best work, we've got to really help them be their best selves, not just at work, but more holistically. And so we've got this notion of the whole person EVP, and we've used that particular business research group to help us, better understand the challenges that some of our colleagues have, and to help inform some of our programming, some of the things that we've got to lean into more. So Yeah, it's been good. And just one other thing that I would mention, the business resource groups meet with the CEO once a year, and they meet with the entire executive committee once a year. So they've got kind of
Wow.
two at bats where they come to the senior leadership and talk about the issues. So part of it also is creating real sponsorship and transparency and visibility to the issues that these folks see for their respective groups. So it's been a really great thing for our company.
It is such a best practice, because what we hear far too often is that employee resource groups, business resource groups, are much more leveraged amongst each other as connectivity instead of sharing ideas, being used in a meaningful way. Again, for our listeners, best practice here from Susan and Citizens. Absolutely. Very unique approach. And I know that you leverage a lot of your time, not only as an executive sponsor of caregivers, but you also spend a lot of your own personal time with nonprofits supporting caregiver communities as well.
I do. Yeah, I mean, community is we haven't really talked about that. Community is a real big deal here. I mean, as I said, we talk about kind of the three C's: colleagues, customers, and communities. And actually, at the time of the IPO, we added shareholders. Too bad it's not a C, but it's an S. But real important.
It is.
And actually, that focus on the three C's actually goes back 30 years. So there's a real deep history that certainly predates me, but it has stood the test of time. And that focus on the community has been it's authentic. I mean, I came from a competitor who also was focused on the community, but it's palpable here. I mean, it is embedded in most of our senior leader meetings have a community component incorporated. And I think we punch above our weight for we're a medium-sized company, and we spend about, call it, almost $19 million a year, but we get so much more from just volunteerism. So our colleagues volunteer like 220,000 hours, over 220,000 hours a year. They serve on 1,000 plus boards and committees. So it is very much a part of the DNA. And we've woven it into, again, back to the ecosystem and knitting things together. We've woven it into our development agenda. So as an example, we now do community skills-based volunteerism. So we'll go out to some of our nonprofits, almost like consultants, and find, consulting, if they could hire a McKinsey or a Bain or one of these big consulting firms, what are the kinds of things they're struggling with? Sometimes they're HR issues, sometimes they're technology issues or data or marketing issues. And we'll put together a group of colleagues who will go and help them. And it's great. It's a win-win, right? Great development for the colleagues, great for our partners, our community service, our community partners. And then we actually haven't announced this yet, but we're going to start to offer a community sabbatical for our colleagues. So now you kind of look at wellness, right? And so people are so stressed and stretched, as I said earlier. What we've been thinking about, what do people value the most? And it's kind of time, right? And it's time, and people need to kind of reset. They need to recharge. We've got a very passionate workforce as a general matter about, a whole host of causes. Can we offer a community service sabbatical? And so we're going to start in a very small, kind of contained way, but assuming that takes shape and goes as we think, we'll look to further expand it.
It's something that I talk to my executives about quite often, is the need to support your community. Because I don't know, I'm sure you know this, I read a stat that 50% of those who actually invest in their community have higher probabilities of promotion, have expanded skill sets. It is such a benefit to get out and do something different but it benefits your role and it benefits your current organization.
Yeah. And there's neuroscience, right, that says, right, all sorts of endorphins are released. So it's just,
Yes.
when you start to think about kind of the whole person, it really, it ticks a lot of boxes. And again, for a company that, we run things very lean. So we look to optimize and maximize everything we can. And we generally don't do, as I think about our agenda, we try to make linkages across different parts of the organization so that we can really optimize and maximize.
Mm-hmm. I definitely have experienced your community outreach, and it is always second to none. And of course, every time I step into Citizens Bank Park to watch our Phillies out here on the East Coast, which we are heading there on Thursday with our son who's coming home from the Navy, definitely experience and feel your community involvement. Okay, so we are coming to the end of our time. I have so many more questions for you. Wish we could do a part 2 here. But we do something at the end called rapid fire questions. So these are 1-sentence questions with 1-sentence answers. So our audience gets to know you a little bit better. Are you willing to play?
Sure, I'm in.
All right, let's do it. What is the biggest challenge you're facing as an HR leader today, and how are you approaching it?
I would say the biggest challenge is the pace of change and level of transformation that we are driving through the organization, and I would suspect this is not unique to us. And just the organization and colleagues' ability to absorb that change, and our leaders' ability to lead through that. And I would say the part 2 to that is all of that change is giving rise to the need to kind of rethink our operating model and to rethink, how we structure the organization, how we structure roles, how work gets done. So in terms of what we're doing about it is, coming back to leadership again, not to sound like a one-trick pony, but we are, as I said earlier, we double down in our investment in our leaders, and have done some really incredible work with that group to really help to equip them to lead through this change. And we're taking on a number of efforts to relook at our operating models. Given our business strategies, we're engaged with a number of partners and relooking at our operating models and seeing how we can really think about work differently. And quite frankly, as most companies, right, we're looking at AI as something that can really help to transform the organization in so many different ways, not least of which is from a efficiency and cost point of view.
What's your first 90-day playbook that you would advise for a new head of HR?
Okay, this is an interesting time to come into.
Wouldn't
interesting and exciting, yeah. I think it starts with, I think the most effective CHROs, and I would say this applies more broadly as well, is you got to understand the context within which you're operating. And so really taking the time to understand the business, to understand the external environment, to understand the competitive landscape. I think that's kind of numero uno in my opinion. I think a close second is really leaning into the key relationships and building relationships, not just at the senior level, but I think, throughout the organization, because I think, one of the important, as we think about creating a culture of inclusion and belonging, which I think is so critical to when you start to think about innovation and high performance, it's good to be able to really understand the perspective at all levels of the organization. And the third constituent that I think is absolutely critical is the board, which I think is quite unique for the CHRO, and really understanding the dynamics of the board and starting to build those board relationships is important.
Exclamation point on that. If you could have your own billboard that would reach millions of people, what would your message be?
That's a good one. Maybe I can ask ChatGPT. I would say invest in yourself, and I would put whole in parentheses before self. So invest in your whole self. I do think that again, the importance of, of curiosity, of intellectual curiosity, the importance of, staying current with your skills. One of the things that we're so concerned about is just how skills obsolescence is just, rapid fire. And, how do we ensure that people really stay current? And so, carving out time for people to do to be able to invest in themselves, but not just professionally, personally as well. We're whole people.
Mm-hmm.
So,
what book have you read most recently that you would put on your top list as a giveaway?
That's a tough one. I would say, I love leadership books. I mean, again, it sounds like this is the only thing I really enjoy is leadership. But I would say, I love reading books about people who are in leadership roles. I like reading like some of the best thinkers, like, Simon Sinek and others like that. But people who have really, so actually Coach K from Duke, he what's his book called? Leading with Heart. I think is a great book. There's another great little book. And I spend a lot of time in the car, so I'm a big podcast person, so I don't have tons of time to read. So I do look at this book. I like thinner books. But there's a great book called, what's it called? The Hero Effect by Kevin Brown.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Really great, and it's a life book. I mean, it's about leadership, but there's a lot of real important life lessons in there in terms of, how can I be extraordinary versus just ordinary, through acts of kindness and leadership, etc. So those would be two that, and then the last thing I would say, again, gets back to kind of the whole person, is I've been very obsessed is maybe too strong a word, but the whole concept of wellness, and really been attracted to educating myself around functional medicine. And there's a great, this isn't a book, but a great podcast by Dr. Mark Hyman, which is really about food as medicine. And it's about, living a healthy life for as long as you can. Right. And really, it's just a fantastic. His thoughts are, I think, very well formed, and just really inspiring to kind of work on the whole wellness aspect of one's life.
Are there any other podcasts that you'd recommend?
The other one that I'm addicted to, other than yours, is How I Built This by Guy Raz. I enjoy, again, it kind of comes back to the leadership thing. I enjoy hearing the stories of, how people became entrepreneurs. And so there's some really, really interesting podcasts or guests that he has that, quite frankly, it demystifies this whole concept of innovation, right? We have this, we think these people are, some of these people, the way they've kind of fallen into their ideas is really inspiring, and achievable, right? So.
Absolutely. Where can people go to learn more about you and about Citizens?
Okay. I guess probably the best is LinkedIn for me. And certainly Citizens, I would encourage folks to follow us. Hashtags Citizens Colleague is a great thing on LinkedIn to follow. In fact, we're pretty proud. I think we have like over 3,700 followers. And just to put in perspective, a company like Nike, that's a global company, has over a little over 7,000. So we've got a very active colleague base that is very active on social media and kind of telling the citizen story around communities, colleagues, and customers.
Love it. Today, we have been joined by Susan LaMonica, Chief Human Resources Officer at Citizens Financial Group. Thank you again for joining me, Susan. It has been such a pleasure.
Thank you. It was great, Berta.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HRMorning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.